McDonald's food, don't want to put their hand up. What's interesting about McDonald's is that years ago, you know, when they started out, they kind of hit on an interesting innovation, I guess you could say, is that if you go to a typical McDonald's today, the people who work there and who make the food are not necessarily particularly experienced cooks, right? They're people who are out of school, out of prison. They're not, I mean, these are people who don't necessarily want to be there. They're there for the money, right? No one wants a career working at McDonald's. But what they've done is they've figured out how to convert really complicated cooking processes into simple steps. If you want to cook a hamburger, for example, you need to take a piece of meat. You need to make sure you cook it to the right temperature. You need to put it with the other ingredients, et cetera, et cetera. And there's actually a lot of complicated steps. But what McDonald's figured out was, okay, you take this box, put it into this box, you press this button, and then out pops a hamburger. And that means that you make complex things more simple. I think that is what we want to try and do as best we can with our communities while still retaining the personality of them. So I guess what I'm saying here is we should be intentional. Most communities that I've seen around the world are completely unintentional. They just spring up. I mean, I think a good example of this is Linux. I don't think Linux started out with, I'm going to build this complicated community strategy. He built a kernel and people crowded around it and started contributing, and that's great. But I think when we go into it and our focus is to build out a community, and this is typically with companies, I think we can make some plans that can ease some future tensions down the line. And essentially what I'm thinking here is that we want to kind of build an exoskeleton that wraps around a typical community member. So, you know, so when you're Frank and you join this new project, your expectations are set. You have the tools and the resources that you need to be successful in that first contribution. But when you're a regular in that project, you're able to get access to the right information, have good relationships with people, feel rewarded in different ways. So the crux of what I've spent my entire career focusing on is what are the nuances in how we build one of these exoskeletons, and how do we apply this to lots of different communities? And these communities vary tremendously. And every community really is different. The communities in hardware are radically different to software. That's radically different to data science. And even within those areas, I mean, just a good example of this, I think, is Ubuntu and Red and Fedora. Those are two Linux distributions that operate in very different ways. And they've got passionate people on both sides of the fence, but they just do things differently. And that's fine. So I think what we don't want to do is build a one-size-fits-all box that everybody has to fit into, because no one's going to like that. So essentially what I'm talking about here today is a blueprint for some methods and techniques that I found have been effective in solving this problem. I'm not going to get into tactical specifics because it varies with different projects and different communities. The idea of this is that I think if we build a lens in which we can look at the problem through, then we can focus on the right things to fix and the right solutions to build. So I think the way we start out this is some of you will be familiar with this. This is something that has been in many slides over the years. It's called the technology adoption curve. And the basic idea is when you build a technology, this is kind of how it happens. At the beginning, you've got innovators and early adopters. Everyone in this room is basically in that category. As you kind of get up, you get that hump is basically where consumers kind of get into it. This is when people read Engadget and Mashable and whatever else. And then you get the late majority, which are people who are a little later to the game, who, you know, are just getting an iPhone or just getting an Android phone. And then you got the laggards at the end, which is primarily my family in England. And this is fairly consistent in how it works. I actually think you can take a similar map to how people are able to do good stuff in communities, is that over time you get some people who kind of get started and get involved, and a lot of those people will get confused and just move on. But then what happens is you get this hump where you just get these regulars, and people have got into the groove of the project, they're enjoying it, they're contributing regularly, they're having a good time, they're building friendships and relationships with people. And then the old timers kind of tails off. You get a few people who are there for a long time because people have kids, they change interests, whatever else. In both the technology adoption curve and the community curve, you get this thing called the chasm. How many of you are familiar with this? So some of you, that's what I figured. Like, this is something that's been fairly consistent in technology over the years, is that when you get to this point where you're kind of on your way up and you're thinking things are going pretty well, you can fall into this chasm. And this is the space in between something being an interesting technology and turning into the mass market. And this is where most startups in Silicon Valley go crushing into It's just a giant pit of terrible mustaches and single origin coffees. But that requires, solving that chasm requires not just engineering, it's marketing and sales and all kinds of stuff that needs to fit together to make it successful. I believe that you can apply the same thing to communities. When you join a project, there are hundreds of stories I've heard over the years working on open source where people join a project and they can't really get into it, they can't figure it out, they can't get stuff done, because I think they hit that chasm. And that's when a project is, in the beginning, in the earlier days, it's small, it's personable, you can ask questions to individuals. But as you get bigger, it's harder to kind of help newbies get started. So what happens is they just get lost, or people try to automate everything and, you know, send thank you emails to new people with computers and things like that, which is a terrible idea. So part of what I've been focusing on over the years is how do we do that? How do we help people to kind of become those regular sustained contributors? Now, some of you will be familiar with this thing, Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs. This is kind of all the things that we need. It should have one addition in there. And I think this actually maps to a lot of things that we do, is that there's certain things you just need to figure out before you can figure out other things. I run an event every year called the Community Leadership Summit, and it happens just before OSCON. And basically a load of community managers come together just to kind of share ideas and insight and learn from each other. And one of the things that's interesting about this event is that the vast majority of community managers that I've worked with or that I've seen focus on a very narrow set of things. It's blogging and social media and outreach and going to conferences and waving your hands around and doing talks. And in my mind, the way in which you build a great community is, it's not just that, it's workflow. And it's how do you incentivize people, and how do you define and harness reputation in different communities. So I think we want to get the earlier pieces in place first before we get to that outreach phase. And the way I look at this is, it's kind of like this, is you get this new person on the left-hand side. And the thing that will get them excited about joining your project is that they'll use it. I'm pretty sure that every Linux developer started out as a Linux user. Every Ubuntu contributor started out as an Ubuntu contributor, started out as an Ubuntu user. So you start using it, and then you get into this kind of cycle. And the first thing you need to figure out is, how do I actually do something? What's the workflow? How do I get the code, clone it or fork it, make something, submit it back, get it reviewed, and feel pretty good about that? That in itself, just that one piece, can be incredibly complicated. I mean, just the tool chain bit for a lot of open source projects is ridiculously complicated to set up. Anyone who's tried to do documentation using kind of LaTeX and HTML and all that kind of stuff will know what I'm talking about. Then what happens is, once you've done your first thing, you then get into relationships. You just want to build kind of relationships, get to know people. The most important thing in a community is not, you know, is not like governance or process or workflow. It's just people getting on and having fun with each other and doing cool stuff. So the next thing is, how do we help people to build relationships, and particularly people who are maybe a little less, a bit more self-conscious about kind of being outgoing about it. The next piece is, then you want people to grow. I think the very best companies, the very best communities are where people feel like they have some personal growth. You know, you join a project, you join an open source project, and you learn more about coding, you learn more about software development and the development lifecycle and all those different pieces. And then finally, invariably, when people have been around for a while, they end up demonstrating some kind of leadership. This doesn't necessarily mean you have a formal sense of leadership. It just means that you're playing an influential role in the project. You're making decisions around what you want to focus on, improvements to tooling and things such as that. So the way in which we do this is, I think we focus on 3 areas: people, how people work, the practice of how we build things, and then how we get people to get involved with participation. So let's first of all look at people. I mentioned earlier on this kind of exoskeleton thing. This is me watching too much Iron Man. To understand people, I think we need to look underneath it. And this is basically what it looks like, a hastily drawn picture of a human being. And I think there's a number of interesting things that we can capitalize on here. The first thing is expectations. As anyone who's been working in anything for a long time knows, it's all about expectations. If people have the wrong expectations in anything, they go off the deep end. And there are 2 types of communities in the world from what I've seen. There's read and write. Read communities are people who get together to share something. You're into Taylor Swift, Game of Thrones, Pokemon Go, whatever it might be. But fundamentally, you get together to consume something and just be around other people that are having fun with it. The next type of community are write. This is where people come together to build something. So this is open source. And there's way more complexity in building right communities because people are actually, you have to figure out openness and transparency and workflow and all those different pieces. The expectations in these two types of communities are vastly different. I remember this in particular when I was at Canonical. The traditional Ubuntu communities are right communities, people getting together to build things. The read community, when we started building the Ubuntu SDK for Ubuntu devices, we deliberately targeted a completely different set of people. And the expectation of people who, software developers who in the read community is like, I just want an SDK that works. I want documentation, API and otherwise, and I just want someone who can help me out when I get stuck. That's it. In a right community, people want to be part of the decision-making process and access to these lists, and you can't have private conversations, and it gets really complicated. So we need to decide what kind of community we're focused on. Then I think what we do is we focus on the different types of users within that. And I think there's three basic types: people who are new, people who are regulars, and then people who just end up being kind of the core developers, core members of the project. And this applies to multiple types. This is developers, translators, advocates, testers, writers, et cetera, et cetera. So, with developers, you'll have new developers. With translators, you'll have new translators. And I think we want to figure out what these people look like before we start building things for them. Because the problem with community management and leadership is there are so many variables that are available. You can spin your wheels on the wrong things that aren't actually helping to solve your problem. This is where I think building user personas is helpful. And this is, before I started doing this, I thought this was just some stupid kind of managerial technique that no one cares about. Kind of like how a lot of companies spend months building a mission statement and they never look at it. But I think this is actually really helpful. And with each kind of persona, it's good to look at these 6 things. What are the capabilities that you expect of that particular person? What experience are they likely to have? What are their motivations going to be? And that varies. What are they worried about? What are they fearful of? How do you think they want to be rewarded? And then what kind of things do they consume? And this will give you a good sense of what we build for them as well as how we target them and bring them in. So to give you some examples, imagine you've got a web developer. Capabilities, probably programming in Python, HTML, CSS, bit of JavaScript, maybe they know test-driven development. Experience, maybe they've got some experience at college, participate in some open source projects, some professional experience. Motivators, they probably like the idea of skills development. They want respect among their peers, building experience and reputation to get a job in the future, maybe some money. They may be worried about things like social exclusion or looking stupid in front of people, or tasks that are too complicated. Like the looking stupid piece, for example, has big implications for code review. People who do code review for the first time, if they're the new type, are often very self-conscious about doing that out in the open. The analogy I have here is it's what I imagine it's like going to a nudist colony for the first time. Everything's kind of out in the open and hanging there for everybody to see. And that's a bit scary the first time you do that. So I hear. Rewards. I think there's 2 types of rewards. You've got intrinsic, the things that make you feel good as a human being, such as respect, reputation, and relationships. But then there's extrinsic, financial, getting money or getting T-shirts or swag or otherwise. And then consumption. Maybe these web developers use long-form tutorials. They use Hacker News, Stack Exchange, YouTube videos, social media, etc. So I recommend that's the first thing. This can be done. You can knock this out in an hour, and it gives you a good sense of who you're targeting. The next piece then, I think, is that we look at the what drives us all as humans. And this is something I find really interesting. And some of you, I'm hoping, will find this interesting too, is that we are fundamentally pretty irrational people. If we think we're rational, but we're actually not. If we were rational, no one would be fat. Everybody would have savings for retirement. No one would get drunk. Everybody would eat kale. I don't like any of those things personally. And but we go out, we get drunk with our friends. We eat Taco Bell at 2 o'clock in the morning. We do all of these things that don't make sense. So we're really pretty irrational. But what's interesting is science has taught us that we're irrational in pretty predictable ways. There's a lot of kind of consistent ways in which we just act in strange manners. And this is the study of something called behavioral economics. And the idea is that traditional economists look at the world as if you can model humans in a spreadsheet, that we are rational, and it's completely incorrect. So I'll give you a couple of examples of behavioral economics in action. The first one is explained with a tax return. Some research found that if you go and fill in your tax return, you will cheat a little bit. You won't cheat a lot. You'll just adjust the numbers a little bit in your favor. And then you sign it at the end. However, an interesting study found that if you sign it first, because you apply your identity to it initially, the level of cheating goes down. Because you sign it first, you say, this is me, and then you go and fill in the form. And therefore, you don't want to go and kind of misrepresent yourself. Another example of this is from Scotland. Many of you will be familiar with these signs. You're driving along, you see this sign, and therefore, you try to keep under the limit because it tells you you're going too fast, unless you're David Mandela when it's a competition. This had absolutely no impact on the death rate or the accident rate in Scotland. So a behavioral economics guy basically said, change it to an unhappy face when you go over the speed limit. And that created a feedback loop, and the death rate went down dramatically. So these are the kind of simple little examples. Another one, an interesting study done by this guy called Dan Ariely, who's a professor out of MIT. He asked a bunch of students to do a test. He made it really easy for them to cheat, okay? They went and cheated a little bit, as we found out. In the next condition, he asked them to read the 10 Commandments first. Cheating went down. And again, it's because you're reminded of what being a good human being is like. I don't think it's a religious thing. This is just a set of principles. So there's lots of these kind of behavioral economics principles that act as like a scaffolding that we can, for a blueprint for humans that we can then use in building better companies or communities or whatever. The problem is that this stuff is really interesting, but it's really hard to apply to the real world. And then I discovered this guy is called Dr. David Rock, who looks like he's about to pounce on us right now. And he came up with this model called the SCARF model. And basically what this is, he's a neuroscientist, and he basically found a bunch of experiments, 5 things that humans care about, unilaterally across the board. The first thing is status. We care about different status types. In open source, a good example of this is people who are new and people who are committers. A lot of people really care about getting that committed bit. So we should ensure that we help the transition from different status types to be simple and easy. You see this in companies all the time. People care about their job titles. Everyone says they don't. Everyone's lying. People do care about those different status types. The second one is certainty. We don't like stress and anxiety. And we see stress and anxiety all the time. So if we can create systems and processes that reduce that, that's typically openness and transparency and building good relationships with people. We reduce that stress and we increase uncertainty. The third one is autonomy, choice. What that basically is that people want choices. And when you have choices removed from you, it's unsettling and people don't like it. This is a good example of this is when you go and buy a car. You can choose the wheel type and the color and all these different things. You're fundamentally still giving Mercedes or Ford or BMW all of your money, but that act of customization feels way more satisfying. So even if you make sure that all of your choices that you set up lead to what you want people to do, that's again an important thing here. The next thing is relatedness. And this is essentially scope, is how does my tribe compare to that tribe? And we see this in companies all the time. Engineering teams who don't like marketing teams, who don't like sales teams, who don't like product teams. So we need to figure out how people sit in different groups and the relationship in between them, because everybody likes to feel a sense of relatedness to the different bits of the group. And then what was really interesting to me was fairness. Unsurprisingly, people want to be treated fairly. But what he found in his research is that most humans don't like to see other people treated unfairly. Because that in itself causes uncertainty. So as building methods in which we can treat people with fairness across the board is, again, something that we can apply here. I was at an O'Reilly Foo camp years ago, and I met this guy called Scott Birkin, who's written a few books. He shared this interesting technique to me, which was, if you want to build something really good, you have to figure out how to build the shittiest version of that thing first. So imagine you want to build a cell phone. Maybe only 2 of the numbers work. It only receives calls from my mother-in-law, something like that. And he said, then what you can do is you can invert that, and then you try to build something that avoids those things. So if you look at the SCARF model, for example, the opposite of status is clicks. The opposite of certainty is stress. The opposite of autonomy is limits. The opposite of relatedness is chaos, and the opposite of fairness is unfairness, but typically that's bias. So I think these are this in itself gives us some interesting things that we can look at how we build our communities. So the next thing is practice. Like, how do we just build effective workflow? And people who put quotes onto slides try to look clever. So I genuinely like this quote. I'm not just trying to appear clever to everybody here. I think this is beautiful. It was from Albert Einstein, obviously someone far smarter than I am. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simple. I think there's this ridiculous premise in people that if we're going to do something right, we need to layer on loads of complexity so it looks professional. And it's nonsense. Is that some of the best things in the world appear simple, but there was so much complexity and thinking that went into making those things simple. It reminds me of a time when I was at Canonical and the Unity desktop first came out, and this obviously caused a lot of consternation. And I saw a comment on someone's blog that basically said, if Canonical had their way, they'd have one button, and when you press it, it would just immediately do what they wanted. And I was thinking, yeah, that would be great. But you want to still be able to get to the core of what you're doing. But simplicity itself is, I think, a good target. So we want to make our workflow as simple as possible for people. The problem is that this involves all kinds of complexity. How do we manage bugs? How do we do code hosting, continuous integration? How do we communicate effectively? Just one of these things you could write books on. So the way I tend to think of it is to look at it kind of a bit like a conveyor belt, is that you get all of these different bits and pieces that fit onto it. So the first thing is, how do you have ideas? How do you help the best ideas bubble to the surface? And here's the thing. There is this idea out there, this principle that every idea could be a good idea. No, people have stupid ideas all of the time, and we shouldn't allow them into our communities. How do we allow the best ideas, the most applicable and practical and pragmatic ideas to bubble to the surface? The next thing is communication. How do we communicate effectively and openly? And obviously there's things like conduct around that. How do we plan? Just planning work varies dramatically. Some communities are just really, you just submit pull requests. Some have more formal, like Kanban style planning. How do you do effective software development? That in itself, people write books and seminars on. How do you do QA? How do you ship and support those releases? How do you get people involved, and how do you govern? And typically what we tend to do is we then tend to drop these like bits and pieces in there. So for example, you may have Slack for communication or IRC, ZenHub for planning, you may have GitHub for development, or you may run your own Git server, or Travis for CI. But I think in itself, just thinking about like, how does something go from an idea in someone's head into something that you can actually see a pull request for, in itself is a healthy mental exercise to go through to put the right bits in place. Because what often happens is people kind of go along this and they get stuck at one point. And this is particularly prevalent for new developers. And this is one of the things I've been kind of talking about for a number of years now, is how we get new people started. Because the problem with new developers or new contributors generally in open source or elsewhere is you have no relationships, no context typically. And you have that nervousness, you have that uncertainty that I talked about earlier on. So I recommend you look at this through this kind of lens. The first thing is, how do you help people to discover that they can actually get started? A lot of projects don't do a very good job of saying, we want your help, we want you to come and get involved. You don't have to be a elite software developer to get started. The second thing is setting up your tool chain. I've seen many projects screw this up, where you have to go and download all these complex dependencies. They work on some Linux distros, they don't work on others. And you've got to set all of these shell variables, and it's just a nightmare. This should really be as simple as just one command or one click, getting everything set up. The third thing is, how do you help those people actually learn the skills to do it? There's obviously things like, how do you learn the programming languages such as C or Python or Ruby or Perl? But then how do you learn the dependencies, the libraries? How do you learn the APIs of the software that you're actually building on top of? And then you've got things like coding standards. Is it tabs versus spaces? Are you using camel case? Like, what are the details that you want to delve into in that? And I think it's best to try and get as much of that in written form as possible, so you're not having to hold people's hands. So many people get to that point on this on-ramp, and then they're like, okay, I want to get started. I've got my tool chain set up. I know what to do. What do I work on? And that in itself can become complex. So I always recommend make it very clear what people can get started with, either by saying we welcome any kind of features, or we welcome features along these lines, Or alternatively, create issues or bugs that basically say, these are the things we need to build, these are the things we need to fix, so people can pick something off and start working on it. At some point along this, people are gonna get stuck. They're gonna need help. So the next step is then, how do people get help? And that can be a mailing list, it can be a forum, it can be a IRC channel, it can be a Slack channel, whatever it might be. But have a very clear way in which people can go and find help. I always recommend personally things like mailing lists or forums, because invariably the time you need help is when no one's online in the chat channel. And then the final one is when someone's done that, when they've made their first contribution, they've done a lot. They've gone a long way. So the next piece is have them get help. Have them feel appreciated. Let me spin through this again. Okay. All right. Okay. The next thing is the regulars. When you're a regular in a project, it's different. You've been on that on-ramp, you've done that. Now you get into this like circular kind of cycle of workflow. And this typically, in a broad setting, is you need to understand the context of the project, what's going on, any standards, current standards of how people are expected to work, be able to discuss with people ideas, problems, bugs. Then you write code, submit a pull request, any CI, have that reviewed, and then often there's some kind of reward, like it might be an intrinsic reward or it may be an extrinsic reward. The problem that I think a lot of people have, and this is less common, I think, in open source because we're usually way more transparent about this stuff, but this is a problem in companies, is in this circular workflow, some bits of this will just be frustrating. Like the code review will take too long or people will be difficult about it. The CI may be cumbersome. You know, there may not be enough information within the context of how we work. So it's important to constantly cycle through this and assess, how do we make this as efficient as possible? The best people to answer this question are the people who are using it. It's not the best, it's not people like me who are looking at it. So I'd recommend thinking about that workflow and how that operates and how you can tweak each of these individual pieces as well. And typically for core developers, most people care about these green pieces. It's the writing code, pull request, CI, and review. And there may be some care and attention about in other things such as mentoring or getting people involved or licensing or working with companies or whatever else. But it's invariably, it's about making sure that the core of that engine is running smoothly. Because I think one of the principles that we've learned from open source is that developers like to hack on their own tools and to make sure that workflow is as quick and efficient as possible. So regularly having a way to assess that, like one of the things I recommend is once every 6 months or so, just sit down and have a conversation. It could be on your mailing list. Like, what can we do to tweak and improve our workflow? And everybody has a chat about it. You make some small changes and off you go. So while doing all of this, I think it's always important to be as data-driven as possible. So to track the effectiveness of this, like how can we ensure that what we're doing is actually making an impact? And I don't think we should be as anal as, you know, A/B testing things. You know, some people get really kind of obsessive about things like optimizing websites using Google Analytics and Tag Manager and all kinds of other testing tools. But I think what we want to stay away from is building this. People just seem to have this obsession right now. I'm going to stand on my soapbox for a minute with dashboards, is having pages and pages of numbers and graphs and all of this other nonsense. And it's as if, you know, we need to make sure we track all of the numbers because then we can figure out how to apply those numbers to solving problems. And in my mind, it's the wrong way around. What we should focus on is like, what do I need more information on? What problems do I want to solve? And then you assemble the numbers around it as best you can. Otherwise, you will spend your entire life caring about your dashboard and making sure that it's as comprehensive as possible and not actually using that information to make anything better. It's just a complete waste of time. So I'd really encourage you to really count the numbers, but really focus on the trends and the patterns, because that's the most important thing that we can do. So the final piece is participation. How do we actually get people involved? I have this kind of very loose rule that I've kind of think of in terms of this, that if you have 100% of your community, about 10% of them are going to be building lots of kind of content that will be consumed by the others. 10% of them will be the really passionate people. And then 1% of your community will be just unparalleled rock stars. And I think the way in which we engage with those different groups is quite different. It is very different. The people who are your 1%, you want to really help them to mentor and support other people, but you want to treat them with like white gloves. You want to make sure that those people feel really rewarded in being part of the community. You don't treat them differently in terms of opportunity, but you make them feel really strongly part of what you're doing. Same thing with the 10%. And with the people in the 90%, you want to always help those folks to feel like they can continually do more and move up and become more influential in the project. You know, in my mind, the core of what we should expect in open source projects is just great work, and helping everybody to be able to do great work is really important. So one kind of parallel here is, how many of you in this room are salespeople? People sheepishly put their hands up. There's this kind of well-known sales lead generation pipeline thing, which is, you know, you have prospects, they go into leads, they go into opportunities, and they go into clients. And what this really taps into is prospects are essentially potential, people who might be interested in getting in working with you. Leads are essentially taking those prospects and seeing which of them are viable. Opportunities are essentially when you start building relationships. This is when the schmoozing happens. And then the client is when you actually start engaging with them. I think when we look at the way this works in communities, it's a bit different. Is that you typically have interest. So someone's interested in a piece of software or hardware. They become curious about it. They want to contribute. They submit something. And then you start building the relationships and participation. So your potential and viability is the same, but engagement and relationships, interestingly, is twisted around. And what this means is that that's why I think it's so important to get the workflow piece right, is to make it really easy and effective for people to do stuff. And then they can be entered into a community where you can start building those relationships. And that's what keeps people contributing for many years. Now, we already talked a little bit about that workflow piece earlier on, and the on-ramp and the cycle of workflow and all the rest of it. But what about potential and viability? How do we actually get people interested and involved? Well, there's a couple of things I'd recommend here. And these are pretty obvious things, like set up a website, make it simple. Again, don't put loads of data on there. Just make it simple. Like, explain what the thing is, explain that people can get involved, create a blog. But importantly, create a content plan. Have 6 months of content that you plan on shipping that people can use to build awareness, and talks about the great work that's going on in the community and highlights interesting projects. Things like social media. I mean, some people spend their entire lives on this. I would hate myself if I did that personally. But social media is valuable, but use that as a tool to raise awareness about the other things that are going on in the community. Obviously, events, meetups, and hackathons, they can get expensive, but picking the right set of events is really helpful. It's a good opportunity to go meet people and to talk more about your project. Set up a knowledge base, and then you can have things like partner relationships, working with other companies or working with other projects, you know, in interesting different ways. The final one is the participation piece. How do you get people to continue to participate and get involved and stay involved? I believe here it's all about relationships. Every community that I've ever met, every open source project that I've ever met, the thing that people cherish the most is that they get to hang out with their friends and do fun stuff. You know, and hey, we're building some great software as well. I've never met anyone where it's only about the software. They don't care about everybody else. They just care about the software. It's a mixture of the two. So helping people to build great relationships and helping people who are doing good stuff to have their reputation bubble to the surface is really important. The one thing that I discovered when I was at Canonical with Ubuntu is there were many times over the years where people who were doing really good stuff never entered into my radar. And I spent every day looking at Ubuntu. And that's because they did really good work, but they weren't necessarily self-promoters. They weren't blathering on about how good they were. They just did good stuff and they got on with it. And in a large community, it can be sometimes difficult to see those people and to help to kind of reinforce them and support them. Those intrinsic and extrinsic rewards are really important. Those helping people to feel good about what they're doing will keep them doing it. But then also people love t-shirts. They love getting challenge coins and hoodies and whatever else. So setting out a kind of a consistent plan for how you can reward people in different ways is good. Great leadership is critical. The open source projects that fail spectacularly are the ones where people can't make decisions. You get into these discussions that never end in anything. So great leadership, and leadership is set by example. You know, people, when you join a project, you're inspired, and you, in many cases, imitate the people who lead your project or your community. Obviously, great conduct. We want people to get on with each other and have a way in which people can evolve and grow. You know, we talked earlier on about there's different status types that people care about. Status is not just formal titles. it's just kind of being in conversations and being counted on. Like somebody asking for your opinion can be incredibly rewarding. You know, if the leader of a project asks for your opinion about something or defers a decision to you, that in itself can give you a sense of growing in status. And then where applicable, gamification can be interesting, but there are many risks with gamification, particularly when applied to communities, because people can game the system. But I think thoughtfully applied, you can do some really, really good stuff there. So in conclusion, bringing this into a close, my view here is be an eternal student and just keep learning from your audience. I know it's a cliche that we should all learn from our failure, grow from it. But without sounding like a cliche, this to me has been the most valuable part of my experiences. I've been so wrong about so many different things over the years. And I'm sure a lot of what I'm talking about here is wrong. And every time people say, you know, I don't think that's right, I think you could improve in this way, I think this could be better, it always enriches me and it helps me to be better at what I can do. And that's why I think we should learn from our audiences. There's a lot of community managers in the world, but the people who really matter are the people who are doing the work, the people who are getting on with things. I think the goal of a good community leader is to just help to facilitate that feedback, that opinion, those kind of behavioral economics principles, and just to make things easier for people and do better stuff. Thank you.
Is this live?
That is.
This one is.